a critical angle. Other publication, his book Freud and the Politics of Psychoanalysis, deals with the political context of and content of Freud's writing. Several other articles investigate topics concerning trauma, discourse, and justice, such as Trauma and Justice, the Moral Grammar and Trauma Discourse from Wilhelmine, Germany to post-apartheid South Africa in 2007, Trauma in Court in 2003, and Identification, Suspicion, and a History of Traumatic Disorder in 2002. And also, a personal remark, he was my supervisor of my PhD.
So, yeah. In this room there's one more supervisee, Randall, who's sitting there, and this one more person whom I examined for the PhD. So I can say that I wasn't able to attend all the papers, unfortunately, because I'm teaching 4 courses this week, and it's the first week of the semester. So, but although I haven't been in all the sessions, I think I know more of the papers that were presented than may be obvious by my presence here. I don't want to give a paper, of course. I just want to make some comments. My impression from looking at the program is that the program, of course, dealt with the trauma testimony discourse, and that maybe one could shortly put it into some context. We have other contexts of testimony or testimony discourse. One is the legal one. Somebody who is basically not affected by what was happening, who is not part of the event that is in question in court, or that may be the victim in certain criminal cases, is asked to tell of an event, and the language, the spoken word in court, will have legal relevance. It may have an impact on punishment, on decisions of whether somebody is guilty or not. So an event that happened outside the courtroom, that is not visible in the courtroom, because otherwise one wouldn't need a witness to tell about it, is made present by the speech of someone who has seen, who has been present at that event outside. Another form of testimony that is somewhat different from the trauma testimony is the testimony that has to do with faith. The person who testifies about his or her faith testifies about something that is, again, not visible at that moment. It is something that is inside. It is a trust, a belief in the love of God, in being a chosen person, and this is made present by words, and the aim is a kind of a declaration that is supposed to convince the audience of the truth of what is being said. So we have again this issue of truth that is evoked by a certain form of speech, by a certain form of staging this speech, because of course a testimony in court is a certain form of staging a certain type of speech act within a very specific institutional framework. And a declaration of faith or of a vision of someone, of a belief in a transcendental power, is another form of staging a type of testimony among believers, or in order to gather believers. A third type of testimony is the historical witness. We have had, I think, a few papers here that were very historically oriented in that sense. We have that in Israel. We have various institutions that use witnesses that testify on historical experiences. They go with school kids or soldiers to concentration camps, or they appear in memorial institutions and so on, and they tell of experience that they had at certain places, and that of course are no longer visible, that are no longer present now, but they were there, and because they were there, they can give, and they were affected by these events, they can tell about them. All these three types of testimonies are not necessarily traumatic testimonies. The fourth type would be the trauma testimony that was the center of this conference. And I think it differs from the other types and has similarities with the other types. And I think in many of the papers that were presented here, these overlaps were actually made central in their presentation. So a speech act that is supposed to represent trauma represents an inner event or an inner experience or an inner wound that is invisible, that is made present only through the speech act. Nobody can see a trauma. You can hear a testimony about the trauma. You can see symptoms of the trauma, but you can't see the trauma as you can't see God in the declaration of faith. But you can be impressed by the declaration that this is presenting an inner truth or a past truth or a truth outside the courtroom. So what happens in all forms of testimony, of course, is that you make present something that is not present by speaking, and you try to convey that what you're conveying is the truth. So there is a certain type of speech that is used in order to convince the audience that this is a type of truth, and the truth that trauma discourse is about is an inner truth. It's not a transcendental truth. It's not a truth of the past. It's not a truth of an event that happened with legal relevance. And also in the paper that I heard today on these Italian texts, what you analyzed is very much the type, the rhetoric that presents this trauma by repetition, for instance, or by we heard an analysis that you gave on the distancing and on the hesitations and the way the speech act accumulated through this testimony. So I think there are certain features that we identify today with expressions of trauma, and that we use in order to interpret a certain form of testimony as a trauma testimony. They are markers for us. And they are, to a large extent, medical markers. I mean, we use them from manuals of psychologists and psychiatrists, and we say people who give lists, people who are very repetitive, people who cannot say certain things, people who distance themselves. We take that as a marker of a certain inner state, of an invisible inner state, and this is the expression of that inner state. And so I think we have with trauma testimony, we have, as we have with other forms of testimony, we have certain linguistic features that for us are indications that there is an inner truth being transmitted by these words. And when they are lacking, then we are suspicious, and we say, okay, but his speech was completely coherent, he seemed very at ease, and so is this really a trauma? We need these certain types of markers, otherwise we are not convinced by the truth. But these linguistic markers are considered by us as listeners as markers of truth, as judges have markers of truth for people testifying in court, as we have markers for the truth of testimonies on a higher power, as we have certain markers we use to see whether a historical witness really, whether that was possible if somebody tells us something about something that should have happened in a certain place. This seems logical to us, and so on. So with trauma we have also these markers, and my impression was, in the papers that I heard, that there seems to be a kind of consensual position. I mean, there seems to be quite a large consensus on these markers. They are rarely questioned. Most people seem to agree that when these markers are present in speech, that we then can speak of an inner wound. So I think this is one of the features of contemporary trauma testimony discourse, that it seems to be largely consensual in this type of interpretation of how you interpret, or what language has to be present so that you can say this has been the language of somebody traumatized. It has very interesting effects, because when you start to mix it, for instance, if a refugee cannot present a coherent story of persecution, the immigration officials are very suspicious. But when you can bring a psychiatric expertise that this person has been traumatized and that therefore the incoherence is explained by an inner state, then the story achieves additional credibility rather than having a lack of credibility. So once you start to mix the genres, the legal testimony and the trauma testimony and so on, you get very interesting inversions. Just one comment that I wanted to make. Another comment from looking at the program and from listening is also what struck me as something that is not being said. You know, when trauma testimony, a lot of it is about what is not being said, what is inconceivable, what is impossible to say, and so on. Something that seemed to have been impossible to say in this conference, and this is in no way blaming anybody, it's just trying to state a fact that impressed me, that there seems to have been no talk about testimony on trauma of those about whose trauma we as Israelis are responsible for. So there has been no analysis here of trauma testimony of Palestinians.
It has been.
Okay, where?
A little, but some.
Palestinians do not figure in any title.
No, it doesn't have to, but when speaking about waltzing with Bashir...
No, sorry. Waltzing Bashir is about the trauma of an Israeli soldier.
Yes,
it's not about the trauma of the Palestinians.
It's a trauma who hides another trauma.
No. That's exactly the point. You see, you can speak about the Israeli perpetrator trauma, and some people can even get upset about the fact that Israelis are called perpetrator. But we are always speaking about our own trauma. The Palestinians are not human beings.
No,
they are not. Their mental states are not being analyzed.
José, can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
We have to deal with a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem which is connected to the fact that trauma is not only a problem of the victim of the trauma, can also be in the same time, the trauma can come in from something that that hurt me, but the trauma of course comes from something that I have done, or that I have seen, or that I have to take responsibility. The question of responsibility inside the trauma testimony discourse has been a subject that we try to talk also about. Of course, we have a lot of things that are happening around us that we couldn't talk. Around us these days, we have a lot of traumatic events that happen, and we don't talk about them. So the question is, if we manage maybe to deal with different dimensions and different problems and different issues. The issues of the responsibility as a traumatic experience have been an issue that we talked about. We didn't talk about maybe a lot, but we took it into account.
Yeah, you see,
it's simpler. We cannot represent the Palestinians. That is obvious, right? And the Palestinians cannot come here to represent themselves. That is also obvious, right?
No. First of all, no. Neither your first statement is obvious, nor your second statement is obvious.
You can represent the Palestinians. You claim that you can represent the Palestinians. I'm not sure that they want you to represent them.
No, I claim that I can talk about them, as I can talk about Indians, and as I can talk about... Huh?
Why not?
No, but no. I hope that we will do... I hope that we will have more conferences, and I hope that this conference is just the beginning of research that we can continue through meetings, local meetings, international meetings, and of course I will be personally very glad to continue this research together with Palestinians.
No.
So the question is not that. I think that the best is that we can close what we have done and not speaking about what we didn't do.
I think when you have a conference on trauma and you speak about what can be put in words and what not, I think it's absolutely in place to say what has not been put in words in 4 days. I wanted to make that statement, and that's all. I would like
Okay.
Other comments? I only make kind of introductory comments.
Okay, some person don't agree with me, and it's fine, so maybe yes.
No, I said only that it was an interesting point, but it's normal when somebody, José, when somebody makes a conclusion, it's very common to say what is done, what is not done, what we could have done, and what we could have done another. I find it just normal. It's okay.
Okay, so let's open it for really open discussions or impressions, not necessarily intellectual, it could be emotional as well. Feel free, please. Everybody. And I think just pass it freely from one another, like, a torch of fire. Yeah? Right.
I don't know if I got you right or not, but I don't think that the trauma testimony discourse is specifically a discourse in psychology or psychiatry or mental health. It can very much, it could be overlapping with legal testimony discourse or religious or otherwise. It's not closed off. That's one thing. I want to say I learned a lot over the last couple of days, and I'm very thankful for having been invited to participate. But one of the things, I keep thinking about how to move us forward, and I think one of the things that I really took away was exemplified by presentations who said, when we talk about testimony, we are going to include these variables, these dimensions in our discussion. Variables of language, variables of space, social and physical space, variables of culture, variables of history. And I think that the humanities scholars really contribute that in a very powerful way, as exemplified maybe very well by Hannah in the last presentation. I do think that psychoanalytic theory, as used here in its restrictive way, the specific. I'm not incriminating psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, all of which are very important and important to me. But I think that there are uses of it that don't point a way forward, and it becomes kind of closed loop. And I think we have to guard against that. We're all at risk of that. I think we need to guard against that and use it to point us forward. And then I also want to say I think it's really necessary to conduct empirical research. If we want to move knowledge ahead, to conduct research. And that can be different kinds of research. It can be research with lots of people, like the first group today was doing. It could be case study research. It could be research of new texts, like Francois was doing. But that we get our hands on something new and talk about something new, and is very important to move forward.
Thank you. Words.
I want to just respond to something Steven said and pose another question that I'd like responses from. Marcus Coelin, I've learned how to pronounce all kinds of new names this conference. He said that he thought that transdisciplinary research was preferable over interdisciplinary research. And his claim was that we should, instead of having one lecture about history and one lecture about clinical therapy and one lecture about literary text, that we should come up with a language that includes all of them. And I want to say that I thought that I agreed with him, but I think I now disagree, because I actually think that the presentations that I learned the most from here were ones that were grounded in language other than that of the analysts, be they clinical therapists or just intellectuals. I think the grounding research in some kind of language of the emek, of the people who are speaking and living everyday life, I think it's important. So that I think I'm now in favor of interdisciplinary studies and not transdisciplinary studies. I want to ask all of you to address the ethical questions behind our conference. I have ethical problems. I can accuse other speakers of having some questionable ethical practices in presenting people's suffering. Presumably this is a place we all want to be in. We've all come here. We don't consider conferences pleasurable, and yet we all want to come here so there's something that we want to do. So why do we want to come here and hear about other people's suffering, and someone who presents a lot of suffering has succeeded? So I'll turn the criticism on myself. Why do I study this? I could study something else. I could study pre-war life. I could study post-war life. I could do anything. Why do I come back to this, and why do I study this the trauma or difficulty or suffering, and what are the ethical implications? How do we do this? What's the best ethical practice, and what are the ethical problems in doing this? Please.
You can either respond to Hannah or raise something else. It's a free...
First, the response to Hannah, I think you come here in order to study yourself, your own stuff. And I think through the language of others, you begin to understand more and more about yourself because you're in the situation as completely as possible. What I found very enriching in this conference was that I could understand and be part of the presentations and dialogues with other disciplines. Many conferences called interdisciplinary. This one wasn't interdisciplinary. And I could follow the other language. They translated it now in common language in such a way that I could find that it was neutral. I don't think that psychoanalysis is overused as a powerful explanatory approach. In other disciplines also understand segment. There are other theories used in not in the last one I want to make here is that I was very impressed by the passion of the people presenting and how much they empathy and vigorous and passionate and believed in what they were saying and debated, not hampered by either political correctness or by competition.
Thank you. Maybe those who you can approach, please.
That's more embarrassing than before. What I wanted to say first is how thankful I am for the experience of this conference. That for me, at least, coming from where I come from, trauma studies, which is something that's been discussed here, is almost as if it's commonplace, is a very freakish occurrence. So everyone coming here in the same place, in the same place talking about the same thing, was like homecoming to me. It was wonderful. So thank you very much. It was an experience I'll take with me for a long time. And just a short comment. Since my research deals with the poetry of soldiers, then I have two things to say about that. One, that it stems from personal experience, or at least what I consider to be personal experience, different question altogether. And the second is a very nice quote. I think I heard about the poetry of Randall, Gerald once, who was an American poet and a veteran of almost a veteran of the Second World War. Someone said his poetry was like throwing a grenade in a library. And I think that that to me shows the intimacy that art and the experience of trauma have, in that they both cause some people to repel in horror, and some people to run out of the room, and some people to stick together, and some people to throw themselves on the grenade. And it's only after the fact, years, sometimes never, that people realize what the reaction really meant and how to decipher the reaction to that unknowable thing that happened. And I also think the same way about this conference, that regardless of whether to discuss Palestinian trauma or not, I think it will only be, for me, years from now, that I really understand what really happened to me this week.
just to you, I would like to say that the accidental rhyme is traumatic, is a model I will carry with me and think about.
Thank you very much. I want to say a few words about the interdisciplinary aspect of this. Literature has made its presence felt a little bit in the discussions, and of course it can very fruitfully connect with the other disciplines that have been active here. All of them are part of the history of ideas. Literature can be enlisted in the study, narratological study of testimonies. On the other hand, what I've just heard from Professor Brunner, with whose certain accusation I don't agree, but that's another question, that psychology has a way of looking at markers of the truth, of the testimony. That is what we lack in literature, because in literature everything can be fabricated, and we are much better detecting markers of fabrication or of lie or of fiction than we are of the truth. So in that case, in that sense, that there may be a fruitful exchange of experience. And I want to make one more point in answer to Hannah about the ethical aspect of what we are doing, but probably not what you expect. I think that trauma is one of those human bigs, one of the big issues to which this conference has been devoted, and much of our work. But I think that it is an ethical necessity for us all to make sure that the concern with trauma does not trivialize other concerns within our disciplines, concerns with the things that are perhaps not that big.
Thank you. Yes, please grab the mic.
Hi, my name is Guy, and I would like, if I may, to offer a point for future direction. I'm personally interested in the psychology of risk-taking behavior. I'm from the psychology department, and I was wondering whether there is, I guess there is, a link between trauma and risk-taking behavior in general, human risk-taking behavior. And more specifically, I would like to suggest, if I may, for a future conference, to discuss issues regarding risk-taking behavior, physical risks, financial risks, whatever kind of risks, and trauma, and to discuss empirical evidence, and that's it.
I see that you commission us with further work.
Yes.
I think that coming from Israel, like myself, I would have loved to hear and see more presentations about combat trauma, because so many men in Israel, and very few women, but there are some already, have experienced combat. And it is now common agreement among researchers of combat and of war that anybody who has stayed for a while on a battleground is traumatized. And for that, since so many Israeli men have experienced combat, I mean relatively many if you compare it to other societies, I think it's very important that if there is another conference, there will be more discussion and more presentation about combat. And another thing that occurred to me comes from ancient Greece. There's nothing to do with combat trauma,
there is a saying, I'm not sure if I will pronounce it correctly, tapatemata matemata, meaning that knowledge comes from pain, from pathos, from trauma. So basically, if we are privileged to have more knowledge than in previous generations, we should thank or be thankful that historically we had the opportunity to experience so much trauma in the 20th century, which is the biggest century in terms of collective trauma. Thank you.
There was one sentence that Chana said in her lecture, and I think that that's time to react to that in order to what I say to José and to the thing that Gerald is talking about now. You said we have so many things. I mean, I don't quote exactly, but you said, why to go to the 17th century or to go to Cambodia while we have so many things here to learn about and to talk about, which is connected to what you just say now. Of course, but I think that it's very necessary to go everywhere and anywhere in order to learn about ourselves, in order to understand better, in order to see things, and to deal with them maybe with more distance and more neutrality. So I think that sometimes the content is not so important as trying to find together communication, concepts, tools to understand better things. So in this point of view, in this perspective, I have to say that I'm very happy, and I want to thank every of you to have come in here. And the most interesting thing for me happened today, this morning, when the people of Natal came and presented their work, and actually every one of you arose a problem, an issue that is connected to different perspectives. While you were talking, Judith, about the condition to accept a person who wants to testimony or not to accept that, I didn't have time to ask you what are exactly the conditions. Are you sure that there is not implicit conditions? And of course, this is problematics that can be deal with a lot of things, including institutional consensus, ideological consensus, political consensus, etc., etc. And when Rivka was talking and making a beautiful analysis of testimonies, you were so close to our work as literary researchers, analyzing the process of writing, and it reminded me the lecture of Carol that spoke yesterday on text from the Revolution, and show us how important was the detail, the contingent detail in something that was changing. We have to understand always and also why things are changing and why things happen like they happen. And the revolution 300 years ago is connected with the testimony of today here in Israel. And the same with Keren, that she was talking about the distance, the separation of the self from the community. And then I was thinking, well, maybe 20 years ago, but what we are doing today, when the soldiers are all the time talking with cellular phone, and they never disconnect themselves from their family, from their community, from their friends, is it something to do? Do we have to deal with that today? When we talk about witness, and it is also connected to one of the issues that we want to talk, that we maybe didn't manage to talk a lot, but it was something that was in our project. What to do today in the society, which dimension is so strong and has to influence us, and has also in ethical problems. So, and everything and all this stuff rose from you coming from the field, yes, from the field. So yes, so I think that in this point of view, we managed to do something not so bad.
José, you want to?
No, I think that's a wonderful concluding statement.
Yes.
So really, you managed to achieve here something in those 4 days. So
I'm sorry that I'm the one who did it.
that's okay. I think you summed up what happened here. So really.
Okay. Now, Michel made the virtual speech, and I will just want to say a few words to each and every one of you. Those who came from long distance from abroad and were very resilient to stay all the time, feeling committed, but did stay and contribute a lot. Our Israeli colleagues from all over, and those who chaired, and all those who were interested, our audience, I want to thank deeply from the bottom of my heart. I think we together made a very fruitful conference. And of course we have thoughts about the future. I can't say yet what Michel and myself and others will think of it, but I think it will be fair to assure all of you that we'll do something with the vast and rich and deep material that was gathering during this conference. And probably there will be a continuation from one to some sort of another. I also want to thank our assistant, where they are. They are outside. They are very loyal and and helpful. Okay. Yes, I will wait. And while we are waiting, I will insert organizational. Yeah, here you are. We are, Charlotte and Hagai, we are applauding to you for your kind and very loyal work and helpful for this conference. Thank you. I want to thank everyone that we can't list now. There were many in both faculties that made this conference possible, and to our various very dear partners that contribute both effort and of course money to have this conference come true. So always it's a bit sad for departures. You know, departures are a very saddening issue, but we'll have to make it. Although we still have another, we can extend our, because we meet soon to finalize. And I need, before you say something, just a small organizatory remark. I need all the overseas to stay 2 minutes because I had to give you something for the airport. Okay. Now.
Before we separate, we have to thank you, Boris. A very special, really deep conference, and so well organized, and it was really something special. Thank you, Boris.
Thank you. You can say it. I'd like to. Yes, I'd like to hear it.
More thank. Yes, that's what I was going to say. Thank you so much for having the vision, and I know it's been months, nearly years in the planning. So for having made it come to pass, and for having been so open to so many different kinds of discourse and so many different disciplines, and really, and of letting people run over because it was so interesting that it was more important than having coffee. And I think everybody enjoyed themselves a great deal and learnt a lot, and maybe will take us a while till we process it all. And I have a final request that we've been kind of discussing, that you please send out a list of everybody's emails so that people can stay in contact after the conference. So, and thank you very, very much again.
And thank you, finally, thank you, my partner, for 2 years.